get into now the meat and potatoes of this first show. Let me tell you something. I had the pleasure of talking to a legend. I always say if education is the matrix, this woman is the oracle. Her name is Dr. Adelaide Sanford. And I talked to her about the beginning of the school year, what's her advice to principals, what's her advice to the new chancellor of New York City public school system, how teachers should teach, what we should do to reach our children. When I say this woman is going to go down in the books as something between a mix of a Rosa Parks and a Harriet Tubman of education, when I tell you that she has inspired thousands of educators and created leaders right from her school in Brooklyn, from her students in Brooklyn, she produced principals, elected officials, scholars, lawyers, doctors, engineers, and always fought for the right of Black people. That's why this show is important, because we're taking time to honor those who came before us. And if you're a teacher out there and you're teaching a teacher of color and you're teaching in New York City school system, you owe a lot to Dr. Adelaide Sanford. So we're going to roll this clip. Check this out. This is Dr. Shungo Blake, a.k.a. Dr. Blizzy, the nation's hip-hop principal, and this is a special segment of the Classroom Hip Hop 101. I am here with the legendary, world-renowned Dr. Adelaide Sanford. How are you, Dr. Sanford?
I'm well, thank you, and I'm happy to share these few precious moments with you.
I am so honored and thankful that you have given me an opportunity to sit down with you and to just talk to you about things that are important as it relates to educating Black children, children of color, and children who are in the greatest need of having a platform to express their brilliance. And I want to, before we get into the questions, I just want to kind of go over some things for my audience about who you are. And
don't waste a lot of time with that.
I got to point out a couple of things. You have had a full career in K-12 education and higher ed. And, when I did my research, I understand that you were not only a teacher, but you were a guidance counselor, an assistant principal, eventually a principal. Great success in taking what is called a low-performing school and making it a school where children learned and were educated and were taught to be leaders and critical thinkers and go on to be leaders in society. I know a couple of your students who are now out there leading, and I can say that there's not a lot of educators of significance that have not been influenced by you or directly mentored by you. And I'm one of those who have been influenced and mentored by you, and so I thank you again for sitting down with us. You had such a success with this school, Public School 21, Crispus Attucks in Brooklyn. And it just earned this reputation of an outstanding school where pupil achievement soared, teacher morale was high, there was programs for the gifted and talent, brought citywide recognition. And so I want to start off this, I thought it would be very important to sit down and ask you, what would be your beginning of the year message to educators as they're preparing for the school year? We'll be back in a couple of weeks. What is your message to teachers?
All teachers.
All teachers.
That you're engaged in the most sacred occupation, profession, calling that there is. When you have the audacity to tamper with the minds of the young, to influence their sense of who they are, how they got to be who they are, what they can make out of who they are, and what the future holds in their hand. that they can control and make not just a difference, but a positive difference, so that life is better for all people. But primarily, if we're going to take turns, it's time for the improvement of life for people who have been set apart as unworthy, as savage, as primitive, as disadvantaged, as culturally deprived, as at risk, as endangered species, all of those pejoratives. That we have to have some validations for these children. Repetitive, advanced thinking validations of who they are to erase all of those negative pejoratives, and they're still coming. And so I would say to teachers, all teachers, what are the validations that you have your children repeat every day that are realistic? May be different for the privileged, may be a validation of other people, or it may be an evaluation of who they are. But for children who have been oppressed, depressed, it's a validation of their uniqueness, of their strength, of their power, of their ability, of their mind, of their inheritance. And I don't hear enough about that. I have actually gone into schools where the opening signs on the door, please stop here. Don't go to the office. Don't go to the classroom, teacher. Everything is what you shouldn't do. How many of them say, welcome, we're so glad that you're here. You are important to us. We are here as teachers because of you and your children. I long to see that, that validation. So an atmosphere that's welcoming, validations of who they are, or an acknowledgement of who they would like to be if they have been of the oppressor. I think that's very important, and that's what I would like to ask for teachers, that they enter a welcoming, warming embrace.
You know, I'm thinking about what you just said, and I can't help but think about the role of the black teacher. And I think specifically the young black teacher coming in, because I've often, or I'm beginning to hear, I don't want to say often, I'm beginning to hear, if I close my eyes, language of the oppressor in the mind of young black teachers as they describe young black children. What is your message to black teachers entering into the teaching profession?
My message first would be understand what it is that you're getting into. Understand that you're entering a system that was not built to give you freedom or liberty, that it was a system that was built to do just the opposite. And it's Dr. Raymond Winbush at Morgan State, who did some research on early education of people of African ancestry. And he talks about a conference that was held just after the Emancipation Proclamation became a so-called reality, even though in Texas it took 2 more years. And at this Mohawk conference, the whole discussion is what do we do now that we have these freed Africans? And they outlined the kind of education that was necessary for these released people. And one of the things they said, never let them connect with the continent of Africa. Teach the teachers how not to teach.
So let me ask you this. Do you think that story illustrates the role that you played as a black educator in terms of making sure that the students walked away with the right type of understanding? And how does that relate to what black educators, specifically the young ones coming in, how does that relate to what they're supposed to be doing right now in terms of modeling those same kinds of
Well,
examples?
that's the issue. The issue is that they cannot let the oppressor interpret what we know and see and are. We cannot accept that, whether it's in a textbook, as the McGraw-Hill did the other year in saying in the textbook that the Africans came to America for work. Mm-hmm. We had to jump on that because that's an outright lie. But if we don't know that that's wrong, how do we know that that happened? Because a young man who had gone to a freedom school knew the history of how Africans came to America by force and by stealing and by brutalizing. And he went home and told his mother. That's why I want to bring in the idea of the parent. He said that book is wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, his mother was a doctoral student. This is in Texas. And she went on the internet and told about it. And one of the teachers told me, and we went to McGraw-Hill. I'm saying people from Clark House and some other educators and some lawyers to say, this is not acceptable. You cannot, McGraw makes billions of dollars. In fact, 2 states are textbook states, Texas and California. And a lot of McGraw-Hill's books are used. Now, I'm saying this is the teacher's responsibility as an African American teacher to know what's in those textbooks, to know what's on those tests, to know what it is that the children are being exposed to. Oh, they can get the bus and go to the Holocaust Museum free. But what bus is taking them to the African burial ground? None that I know of that's taking them there to see their history and to know what happened right in New York. So those are the pieces that I think the African American teacher, the teacher of African descent, and I say African rather than people of color, because Asians are of color. They don't have the same issues. Mm-hmm. I hope they do well. Many of them who come here do well. I know they can go home. Mm-hmm. I know they know where home is. I can't.
Do you think white people can teach black children?
Yes, under certain circumstances.
What is your message to the white teachers that are coming in? There's a whole program in New York City called the Teachers Fellows Program, and these teachers come from Midwestern states into New York City. They're doing, they're changing their profession. Some of them are getting licensing, to become teachers on like a fast track. And so you have an influx of white teachers working in urban school environments. What is your message to those teachers who are going to be coming in and dealing with students of African ancestry?
Understand your lack of preparation for the position that you're taking. I'd ask you, have you had people, the color of the people that you're teaching, as peers? Not in a submissive, but as peers. Have you traveled to countries where people of African ancestry and Africans are in charge? Not as a tourist, but with a mind to understand and study. Have you read the great literature written by African educators like Dr. John Henry Clark, like Asa Hilliard, shaped you up? Are you knowledgeable about that? Are you able to evaluate the difference between where you live and the resources that are there and the resources that are available to the children that you're going to be teaching? Do you understand that they don't necessarily like you? And don't feel that because you are privileged that you will be liked and accepted and embraced, because they have feelings about who they know you to be. They don't know anything about a policeman that helps children cross the street. They don't know anything about that. Now, if you can't answer sufficiently to these questions, then you have to reevaluate while you're there. And I believe that principals of African ancestry have a right to ask those questions of white teachers. I did. I had an inventory to ask them. Now, sometimes they lied to get out of it. I know one group, when Eric Halley was personnel director, she asked us if I went out with black men. That's what she told the director of personnel in order not to have to come to 21. Now, I never asked her that question, but that was her impression, was that I was trying to find out something that she couldn't validate as being educationally valid. She couldn't say that the fact that I asked her had she traveled not as a tourist, but as a historian to African countries where African people were thriving well, like Tanzania or Ghana, or if she understood the relationship between Egypt and the rest of Africa. She couldn't answer those questions and say that they were not sound educational questions. So she couldn't get out of coming to 21. So she had to say something that would get her out of having to be assigned there. I think we have a right to ask that. I think a right to have parents on the interview with teachers. We did. It didn't mean that the teacher necessarily had to answer the parents' questions, but parents are psychic. They could tell who was phony and who was real. Then the final question is, are you willing to learn? Are you willing to learn the things that you do not know? Not only to be adequate as a teacher, but to be a human being. Because the way you live and what you have been taught, so much of it is not true. But it has affected you, and it has benefited you. And you have to understand that. And understand that that benefit to you will not be a positive effect on these children. I think we have a right to ask that of them.
And since you brought up principals, what is your message to principals as they prepare for the school year? What should be on their mind in terms
African American principals?
Yes, and more importantly, let me say, what is your message to principals about the education of children of African ancestry? I want to really focus on that message.
I would have to say to principals that you're in a dangerous position, because what you do and what you say and what you propose is going to affect these children. And it's going to make them either your enemy or your prisoner. And which are you going to choose? Most of the time you'll choose for him to be your prisoner rather than your enemy. But I choose for him to be your enemy because I choose for him not to accept anything but the truth. And I don't know if you can arrange that. For example, we took down all the pictures of white people at 21. You know, pink boy, pink girl, blue boy, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. Took down the pictures of the children because they did not reflect the population of the school. So I didn't get too much flack from the union for that. But the pictures of the great Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, I said, but they fought. That's how they settled their disagreements. We teach our children not to fight. We teach them that there are better ways to settle their disagreements. We listen to their point of view. I don't want to put up as a model of behavior people who use war and fighting as models. Union gave me a little grieving, but I won. I think that the principal has to set a tone, environmental tone, in terms of the artwork, in terms of the models, in terms of the images that validate the children that are there. It's all right to know about the others. I know more about Lapland than I knew about Egypt. But it has to validate the children that are there and the community that you're in. And if you can arrange that environmental impact as the principal of the school, That'll make a big difference because you set a standard.
So as y'all can see, profound, profound, profound. She's raising a lot of awareness, raising a lot of issues, and giving us a model in terms of potential solutions. So I want to start with maybe a teacher in the audience. She had spoke about what teachers need to do in terms of engaging young people. She spoke about what black teachers need to do, what white teachers need to do. What are some of your thoughts in terms of what she said in terms of especially young teachers entering into the profession and understanding that the system is not necessarily, no, let's just say, she said it's not geared towards their liberation, it's geared towards their oppression. And she actually used terms that are not used when you talk about equity. There's an issue of equity in education. She used the term the oppressor. So any thoughts from some of our educators, from our teachers?
I like what she said about, oh, okay.
Sure, stand on up.
I like what she
Can you
said.
tell us who you are, please?
My name is Sanji Palmer, and I'm a 6th grade educator, New York City Department of Education. And I like what you said about validating the children. I think that covers how we should plan, how we should teach, how we should interact with the children so that they understand that we are sowing into them, with the expectation that they will grow into their best selves. I think that it's important that they see images that reflect who they are so that they can identify with the person and recognize that they too can be what they're seeing in the hallways, in the classrooms, and so forth. So I thought that her message was relevant. But validating the children covers everything that in terms of how we should move as an educational body. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that she also really laid it out when she talked about the images and why certain people weren't on the walls, because they settled their conflicts through violence as opposed through communication. I thought that was relevant. I mean, what do you think about that? Because I'm sure, I mean, you know, like let's think, like recently we've heard about a lot of statues in the country being taken down for various reasons because people were oppressive or they were slave owners or they were this or that. But she makes a valid point that if we want young people to solve things in a peaceful manner, why would we hold up as examples people who solve things through war and conflict? Any thoughts on that? Yes. Stand up, please.
I think it's common sense, to be honest with you. I think when it comes to text, it's extremely important that our students have, or we can develop in our students of like a love of literacy or literature. Reading is the backbone of education. Even the state math test now is all word problems. They have to know how to comprehend. They have to know vocabulary. They have to know how to read. One of the best ways to do that is that when they're reading text, have them have characters in the text that reflect themselves. So whether it's pictures up on the wall, whether it's the text that they're reading, they have to see people that are reflective of them and their communities if we want them to connect, engage, and if we want them to continue to develop. So I think it makes a whole lot of common sense.
Absolutely, and I got to give you your kudos for the work that you do at that school in Brooklyn, Maya 11, Juneteenth, which is celebrating, you know, the African American experience, and recognizing that well after slavery, 2 years after slavery, there were slaves that were still enslaved because they didn't get the word in the Texas, East Texas part of the country. And so, you know, instead of highlighting July 4th, which was rooted in conflict, you're looking at Juneteenth, which is a symbol of liberation and freedom. So I think your school could be a perfect model to that. We have a guest from overseas, and this is we're talking about education in this country. I don't know if it mirrors what's happening in London and in England. Will you hear her presentation? What do you think? Or could you point out to us where the similarities exist and where the differences exist? And please tell us your name.
Fine, thank you. My name is Philip Smith. I'm a doctoral student here at Columbia University, but originally from London, England. Firstly, I want to say thank you to you, Dr. Blizzy, for creating this space, because I think this space and also what Dr. Sanford said is a reminder of why we need to have these conversations. In listening to what was said, it really reminded me that education is a political activity. And for people of African descent, be that in the UK, in the US, or indeed the Caribbean, the challenges are the same, that we have historically been seen as less than. And one of the things, I think the key messages that I'm kind of reminded of today is that education has to be about us and for us. And one of the things Dr. Sanford said, although she relayed it to students, I think it applies to all of us, is that give us a sense of who we are and give us a sense of how we became who we are and a sense of who we're going to be. And so it's important that we have conversations that centers race, conversations that centers what it means to be of African descent, and those conversations are at school administration level, within the context of schools, within teaching, but also within the images and the messages that we convey to our students. So that's a long way of saying that regardless of where one may be located, the messages and the issues are universal, and therefore the struggle and the attempt also has to be universal.
We'll be right back after this commercial break.